Elon Musk pressed the button. The Russians are in a catastrophe over Starlink, and how Ukraine, US, and Russia wrap up talks in Abu Dhabi. Let's talk about these topics and more with our guest, David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official with us. David, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
David, trilateral negotiations between Ukraine, the United States, and Russia concluded in Abu Dhabi. Russia's dictator Vladimir Putin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev stated that there has been progress in the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, which resumed on the US mediation in Abu Dhabi. What concrete steps or agreements indicate real progress and which remain declarative statements in your opinion?
Well, both sides are reporting that the talks went well, but my understanding is that the only agreement that was actually reached was for this prisoner exchange, which just happened today. And that was an exchange of Ukrainian prisoners held by Russia and Russian prisoners held by Ukraine. While that is positive news, we've had prisoner exchanges in the past, so this doesn't exactly move the ball forward towards a ceasefire.
Really, the only positive outcome we can point to is that the delegations of the United States, Ukraine, and Russia agreed on the exchange of 314 prisoners of war, 157 from each side. This is the first such exchange in the past 5 months and a result of the peace negotiations facilitated by international partners. According to the Russian news agency TASS, Moscow presented stricter demands regarding the status of Donbas at the Abu Dhabi talks. A source cited by the agency reported that the discussions also covered economic issues, territorial arrangements, and a ceasefire mechanism. At the same time, it was reported that Russia has increased its demands, requesting not only the transfer of Donbas, but also its official recognition as Russian territory. This is unacceptable for Ukraine and will never happen. How can this deadlock be resolved? Where is the real economic and other pressure on Russia?
Well, this is the sad part about these negotiations. There have been many discussions with Russia, but Russia really hasn't changed its position on the key issues like territory. And as you mentioned, there have been zero concessions from Russia. It may even be requesting even more than it was requesting before. So that's not progress. We're going backwards. And until Putin gets realistic about territory and recognizes that the territory that is still controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces cannot be given back, it cannot be given to Russia, and also understands that the territory that he has illegally annexed can't be officially recognized as part of Russia. If those things do not happen, then Putin is not negotiating in good faith, and there's very low chance of there being a ceasefire. The more likely potential ceasefire will come only after Russia and its economy are suffering so much that Putin feels vulnerable. There has been some good news on that front, with Europe putting in place new sanctions or getting ready to put in place new sanctions and restrictions on the sale and movement of Russian oil in European territories, perhaps even restricting the use of banking and insurance, which is necessary for Russia's shadow fleet. These are the types of things that could put the additional pressure necessary on Putin for him to make real compromises that could lead to a ceasefire.
David, and we'll talk about fleet later. And really, the president of Ukraine, regarding Russia's ultimatum, stated firstly, if any countries recognize our territories as Russian, it will achieve nothing. Secondly, this is our land. The Kremlin's conditions are rejected, and this is a clear signal. President Zelensky said he hopes that peace with Russia could be achieved in less than a year. He made this statement in an interview with the French TV channel France 2. Do you see the current preconditions for this? What are the risks that hopes for a rapid end to the war could lead to ill-considered compromises?
Well, first of all, one risk is continuing to have talks when Russia makes no concessions, no compromises, is pointless. And it actually just gives the Ukrainians false hope, and it makes people around the world think that this crisis is going to be resolved when it has no chance of being resolved. If it were to be resolved in a quickly negotiated ceasefire that didn't protect Ukraine and ensure that Ukraine would be defended and would have the weapons and resources it needs to defend itself if attacked again by Russia, then that would be the highest risk of entering into a ceasefire.
The French publication L'Express reported that French President Emmanuel Macron secretly sent his diplomatic advisor and longtime associate Emmanuel Bon to Moscow. The visit took place on the same day Macron stated that Europe is technically preparing to resume direct negotiations with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. The visit was not announced. I understand that the envoy's mission in Moscow was to convince the Russian side that Europeans must participate in decisions affecting European security and that they will not simply sign any agreements without consultation. Is that correct?
Well, Europe has a good point. They are an essential party to any ceasefire. They are the ones who've suggested that they may even put troops in Ukraine to monitor the ceasefire, which may be necessary to ensure that Russia does not violate it. And if they do, there are repercussions for their violations. At this point, Europe is also the main funder of Ukraine because there is not much, if any, US funding going to Ukraine. And most importantly, Europe's security interests are at greater risk than the United States. So for all of those reasons, Europe is a mandatory party for any ceasefire agreement and should be involved and included in negotiations if they get closer to being a ceasefire.
About risks, many European security and political leaders believe that the Russian invasion of NATO and EU member states has become more likely due to rising tensions in Europe. The Wall Street Journal notes that it was previously assumed Russia would not be able to threaten NATO until 2029. There is now a growing consensus that such a crisis could occur much sooner before Europe is fully able to respond. What specific military and political indicators signal an increased risk? How do you think?
Well, one thing that suggests an increased risk is the fact that Europeans are now saying that they are going to block the shadow fleet of Russia that transports oil and gas, and they may even stop those ships and confiscate those ships. Were that to happen, it would have to be done likely with force, and Russia could respond, perhaps with its navy or with submarines. So that's one way that things could escalate into more kinetic activity between Europe and NATO and Russia. And if that were to happen, then all NATO members under Article 5 would have an obligation to defend whoever was attacked by Russia.
And Politico reports that Finland is urging the United States not to provide Ukraine with security guarantees similar to NATO's Article 5. There are concerns that Article 5, like promises to Ukraine, could provoke Russia into testing them, and if the response is weak, it could undermine the real Article 5 and its deterrent value. Do you agree with this assessment?
I do not agree with that. Because realistically, for Ukraine to enter into a ceasefire and for us to end this bloody war that is killing so many people on both sides, Ukraine has to be comfortable that if Russia violates the ceasefire, it will be defended. And so that is essentially an Article 5 guarantee, a security guarantee. Now, the difference is it doesn't have to come from all members of NATO. It can come from select countries, and there are a number of countries have offered to provide such a security guarantee, like the UK, France, and Germany. And hopefully the US would also be providing a security guarantee. But it has to be substantially similar to Article 5 because Ukraine needs that reassurance that it will be defended by its allies if attacked again.
And you mentioned shadow fleet, Russia oil exports could face serious disruptions due to potential new EU restrictions on the shadow fleet and increased risks for tankers in European waters. Estimates suggest that nearly half of Russia's oil shipments could be at risk, intensifying financial pressure on the Russian economy, according to the Washington Post. How might, in general, this affect Russia's domestic budget and overall financial stability?
Well, I applaud this development. I hope Europe goes through with it. This should have been done years ago because the only way Russia is going to submit to terms that are fair is if it feels vulnerable, if its economy is hurting so much that it cannot fund the war machine at an adequate level to continue to make progress in Ukraine. And so we need to strike at the heart of Russia's economy, which is an oil and gas economy, essentially. And while there could be some repercussions of doing this, I think it's worthwhile and it's for the greater benefit of the world and certainly the greater benefit of Ukrainians and Europeans whose security is threatened by Russia as well.
And Russia's economy could approach a point of no return by 2026 due to an excessive focus on military production at the expense of the civilian sector, according to EU sanctions envoy David O'Sullivan in an interview with The Guardian. What is the current situation in Russia's economy, as you can say?
Well, just in the last month, its oil sales have gone down a lot. Some estimates are down by 50%. So some of that is due to the U.S. sanctions that the U.S. put on the two Russian state-owned oil companies, and it could also be further enforcement of sanctions, and then also. India reportedly is saying it has agreed with the U.S. not to buy Russian oil anymore. India is one of the biggest customers for Russian oil and gas, so that would also hurt Russia as well. So it's a combination of those things, but it's also important to note that you can't just put sanctions on the books and think they're going to work. You have to enforce the sanctions, and we haven't been as strong on enforcement as we could have been over the last few years.
And about right decisions, Starlinks have gone down across the entire front, say Russian war correspondents. We hope that the Russians will never be able to use them again. Separately, American businessman Elon Musk urged Starlink satellite internet users in Ukraine to make sure to register their terminals. What lessons does this situation provide for integrating commercial satellite networks into modern military operations? And what do you think about this decision?
Well, this is a function of modern warfare where communications technology is essential. Russia appears to be illegally piggybacking on Ukrainian accounts for Starlink and using Starlink, perhaps even for some of its weapons guidance and missile guidance. That's completely improper. And as I understand it from the public announcements, Starlink and SpaceX, which owns Starlink, and the Ukrainian armed forces have agreed to cut off all ability of Russia to utilize Starlink, and Starlink is apparently ending any accounts that it doesn't recognize as being Ukrainian. So that should make it much harder for Russia to utilize Starlink, which is a positive development. And I think it's also a really positive development that the Ukrainian government and SpaceX are working together on this important issue.
And about Ukrainians' opportunity, the armed forces of Ukraine struck the infrastructure of the Kapustin Yar testing range in the Astrakhan region with Flamingo missiles, from where the Russians launched the Oreshnik system. What message does the strike on Kapustin Yar convey to Moscow regarding Ukrainians' rich and strategic priorities, and not only?
Well, this is great, and Russia deserves it because it fired an Oreshnik missile a few weeks ago, and Ukraine is increasing its capacity to reach into almost anywhere in Russia. It's been very creative and innovative in developing weapon systems that allow for a longer reach. And of course, it also is getting some weapons from the West that are also helpful for that. So the more Ukraine can demonstrate the ability to hit Russia anywhere and everywhere, the more vulnerable Putin should feel.
And also, how might this operation affect the stance of global powers, NATO, the EU, and the US toward continued support for Ukraine? If we're talking about long-range missiles, for example, Tomahawk, Taurus, and not only.
Well, hopefully Ukraine is going to continue to get advanced weapons systems. Now, one of the things that has happened over the last year is the US isn't providing as many of those systems, but my understanding is the US is still selling US made weapons systems and weapons to Europe and allowing Europe to transfer perhaps older stock to Ukraine. That's a good thing. And then, of course, there are some very good missiles and weapon systems made in Europe, and those are available for transfer to Ukraine as well. And this is really a two-pronged approach. You have to have the economic sanctions and retaliation against Russia, but you have to pair that with robust arming of Ukraine and the Ukrainian armed forces. So Russia both faces a warfare that it can hardly defend itself against, and economic warfare that is hurting its economy.
About economy in the United States of America, I see that Trump in one interview said, quote, I'm starting to get great economic poll numbers. Reporter, the economic poll numbers aren't that great. Trump, they should be great. Reporter, then why aren't they? Trump, I don't know. How credible are statements about economic performance if they contradict independent poll results? And what impact does such rhetoric have on public confidence in economic policy?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what Trump meant there. That was a bit confusing what he said. I think it's important that we focus on the data. And Trump sometimes likes to put his spin on the data. There are some positives, but there are also some negatives. And so we need to look closely at the data. He says inflation is defeated. That's not exactly true. Inflation is under control, but it's still a problem that we need to focus on. We need to focus on employment numbers and keep those very high, keep unemployment very low. And we need to look at our fiscal situation. Unfortunately, over the last year, we've increased our national debt. That's a problem as well, and that's going to weigh on the U.S. economy. So the results so far after a year of President Trump are mixed. Some good things, some bad things, but a lot of work for the Trump administration to do going forward if they want the economy to be strong at the end of this year.
David, thank you so much for this important and interesting conversation. As always, thanks for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. David Tafuri, international lawyer and former State Department official, was with us today. Please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine. I wish you all the best and see you.
Дякую. Слава Україні.
Героям слава. Дякую.